It's Wednesday, May 7th at 7 Pacific time. I want to thank our guest, Dr. Wynne Moss, for joining us tonight to talk about CWD and a pile of data that's been accumulated in ensuing research out of Wyoming for a 20-year period. Same format as usual. The presentation will be probably around a half hour, 40 minutes, and we'll do some Q&A. Again, Dr. Moss is a researcher and a scientist. She's not a policymaker. BC, we're in kind of a unique position where we don't have CWD everywhere and we don't have high prevalence. So we kind of have an opportunity, and this is also an opportunity for us to learn from other jurisdictions and what their experiences are, which is pretty exciting. So I'll give a quick introduction about Dr. Moss. She is an ecologist with interest in disease ecology, conservation biology, and quantitative ecology. Broadly, she studies how wild populations contend with pressing threats of the 21st century, including emerging infectious disease, climate change, and invasions. She approaches her research using a diverse toolkit that includes field ecology, molecular techniques, quantitative modeling, and synthesis. She works as a biologist with the USGS Survey at the Northern Rocky Mountain Science Center. So, Dr. Moss, really appreciate you coming on and spending your time with us tonight. There's a pile of people who will be interested, and we'll be putting this on our YouTube channel afterwards. And I know there's already a ton of people who can't wait to see it. So if you want to share your screen, we really appreciate you coming on.
Great. Thank you, Jesse. And can everybody see my screen?
Looks good.
Okay. Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here today and talk to you folks about what I've learned about chronic wasting disease and hunting from my own research and from some of the research that I've been studying over the past few years. So I'm a biologist with the USGS Survey. We're a government agency, a part of the federal government of the US, and our role is to provide research that informs the management of our nation's natural resources, including wildlife. So we think a lot about wildlife disease and developing science on how we can manage it. So today I'm going to give you a tour of what we know and what we don't know about hunting and chronic wasting disease. I'll start with a quick introduction to the disease. I'll talk about some of the ways that it's managed by natural resource agencies. And I'll talk specifically about hunting as a management tool. What do we know and what do we not know? And what are the different lines of evidence that people are using to make decisions about hunting during CWD epidemics? And I'll include some recent evidence from a study that we just wrapped up in the state of Wyoming. And I'll end with some open questions about hunting and about chronic wasting disease. And I will also just mention that although this talk is focused on chronic wasting disease, I think it also has some lessons about how we manage wildlife diseases in general and how we might want to go about collecting science about our own management tools. So many of you are probably already aware of chronic wasting disease. Or CWD, as I'll call it for the remainder of this presentation. It is an infectious disease that affects members of the cervid family, so deer, elk, and moose. It's an unusual disease in that it's not caused by something like a virus or a bacteria, but it's actually caused by a misfolded protein called a prion protein. So it's one of the animal's own proteins that gets folded into essentially the wrong shape, and then that misfolded protein causes other proteins to misfold. And that's what makes it infectious and contagious. So those misfolded proteins start to accumulate and spread throughout an individual's body, and they lead to neurological signs, and eventually they lead to death. And they're shed in bodily fluids, and animals can get exposed to CWD through a variety of pathways. They can get it through direct contact with one another. They can get it through exposure to those bodily fluids like saliva or urine, and they can get infected through environmental contamination. What's pretty unique about prion proteins is that they are almost impossible to destroy, and they can persist in the environment and remain infectious for a really long time. And so that's what makes CWD really difficult to treat. And one of the other hallmarks of CWD that's different from many other diseases is in the name, the fact that it is chronic. So once animals have this disease, they often have it, or they always have it until they die. They do not clear this infection, and they can continue to transmit it for many years until they succumb to the disease. So that leads to another characteristic of CWD, in which it often progresses really slowly, and it can take a long time to start to spread through a population. So we often see that it takes a decade or more from the time that CWD first arrives in a population for it to reach pretty high levels. And so that slow biology means that it can also take a really long time to start to see the impacts of management interventions. And I'll come back to that idea a little bit later. So it does take a long time often for CWD to reach high levels in a population, but it does happen. And in areas where chronic wasting disease has been around for a long time, like in the state of Wyoming or in the state of Wisconsin, you can see that the prevalence, which is the proportion of animals in the population that are infected, can get to really high levels. So in a study that our group just conducted in Wyoming's Wind River mule deer herd, over 3/4 of the males in that population were infected with the disease. So we're talking about a majority of adults in that population that are infected with a lethal disease. And you can expect, without doing a lot of math, that there could be some population level consequences of that level of infection. Although those population level consequences have really not been measured in a lot of herds. And you can see there's some differences in the progression that different herds go through. So, for example, in Wisconsin, where they've been battling CWD for a very long time, it's starting to reach about that 50% prevalence level. Whereas in Illinois, where they've had really intensive culling measures, they really haven't seen it take off yet. So all that is to say is that there's some variation in how quickly it spreads in populations, but it does seem like it can reach pretty high levels if it spreads without control. So that's a view of what CWD can look like when it invades a population. And I'll also give you a sense of the growth of CWD on a broader scale. So here's a timeline capturing some important events relevant to Canada. So CWD was first discovered in the 1960s in captive deer in Colorado on a deer farm. And it took more than a decade for it to be found in wild deer. But it was first detected in wild deer in Colorado in 1981. And after that, it started very slowly creeping into new regions. And on the y-axis of this plot is the number of U.S. states, Canadian provinces, and European countries where it's been detected in wild cervids. So it spent a lot of time not quite spreading very quickly. And then starting in about 2000, which was also the year where it was first detected in wild deer in Canada, it's really taken off and it's spread pretty rapidly across North America. And as of this year, it's in 5 Canadian provinces, including BC, where it was detected just last year. So you can see from this map just how big that geographic footprint is. The gray areas are counties or regions where wild deer have been found with the disease. And right there where the arrow is pointing is that first detection in BC just last year. So BC is likely being exposed from both Montana, maybe now Washington and Alberta. And so it's just cropping up. It's at the very beginning stages, as far as we know, in BC. And you can see that really it's starting to be found in a lot of the places that deer have been found. So we're not really seeing that spread has slowed down very much. So all of this sums up to potentially a big problem for deer herds and for agencies that manage deer herds. We know that agencies are spending a lot of money in the millions to try and monitor and manage this disease. And of course, because it affects really important game species and ecologically important species, it can sum up to some pretty large impacts ecologically, culturally, and economically. So a not insignificant problem by any means. So before we get too pessimistic about CWD, I'll also say that there's a lot of people that are extremely motivated to find tools and solutions for fighting chronic wasting disease. So what do those tools look like? When it comes to managing wildlife disease in general, there's a lot of tools in the toolkit. There are some really innovative and creative strategies, things like genetic engineering, vector control, pharmaceutical treatment. And then here on the bottom are removal strategies. These are strategies that are often used to control wildlife diseases that require the lethal removal of individuals. But for chronic wasting disease, because again, it's this prion disease caused by proteins, a lot of these options are off the table. We just they don't apply to prion diseases, or they haven't been developed yet, although folks are certainly talking about some of these strategies. And what we're left with is these strategies here in red. This is kind of our toolkit for fighting CWD. And again, here on the bottom are potentially these strategies that require the removal of individuals. So population culls is where an agency would go out. They might hire sharpshooters, and they would remove individuals themselves, versus recreational harvest is relying upon the participation of hunters in order to conduct those removals. And that's really what I'm going to focus on today, is how well this might work as a management strategy for CWD. So a survey of natural resource agencies in the US and Canada recently asked all these agencies what they were doing about CWD, and they found that restricting the importation of carcasses was used by almost every agency, but the second most common strategy was to increase hunting licenses and quotas to try and boost the number of harvested animals. And that was sometimes done alongside other hunting-based strategies like lengthening the hunting season or adding an extra hunt season. And the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, which is a group of wildlife management agencies, has recommended hunting as a strategy for controlling CWD. So all that is to say, a lot of agencies are already using hunting to try and control CWD. Our question as researchers was, why are they doing this? What information are they using to make that decision? And is it working? So it might seem a little bit paradoxical. You have a disease that's threatening a wildlife population, and so you respond by lethally removing even more animals from that population. And that can seem sort of like a potentially harmful response. So I want to talk a little bit about why there's theory that this should work. Why do we expect that a high rate of hunting would help control CWD? And there is a lot of theory from disease ecology and epidemiology that tells us there's a few different pathways that might lead to an impact of hunting on CWD. And so I'll run through these, and you don't need to necessarily know all of these, but I think it's worth saying that there's a few reasons why we think that this should work. One is that individuals that are infected with CWD often have different behaviors. They are often a lot slower. They seek out different habitat. And so they might be more susceptible to being harvested. And so hunting might be selective, taking out infected individuals and leaving the healthy deer. So that's one mechanism that it might work, kind of a survival of the fittest effect. It can also be selective by just targeting the groups of individuals that are more likely to be infected. Usually we think about harvesting high numbers of adult males, and those tend to be the most infected members of deer population. So if you focus on adult males, you're more likely to be taking out individuals that are infected, and you're reducing the number of mature bucks and the number of infected individuals on the landscape. Harvest might also work by lowering density. You have fewer individuals out there. They're less likely to contact one another. You think of it like social distancing in deer, and that could reduce transmission rates among individuals. We also know that when you harvest older individuals for a long time, it leads to a younger, more uninfected population. So that would also reduce prevalence. And then lastly, the fact that this is chronic means that, again, individuals are infected for many years, often spreading that to other individuals over the course of their lifetime. And if we increase mortality and we just limit the amount of times that the amount of years that animals can continue to transmit the disease, we could knock back transmission and CWD prevalence. And we could also knock down the size of that environmental pool, which also contributes to disease transmission. So you don't need to know all of these mechanisms to understand this talk today, but I'm mentioning them so that you understand that there's a lot of reasons why we think hunting could be effective. There's a lot of theory behind it. And that theory is supported by modeling and computer simulations that predict what CWD prevalence could look like under some different assumptions about harvest, about survival, and about disease transmission. So there's been a few simulation studies, and these tend to show that male harvest in particular seems like it can slow the spread of CWD over time or even lead to decreases in prevalence over time. And that's a good sign because male harvest is also sustainable in from a population perspective. So harvesting a high amount of adult males can still leave you with a sustainable population, meaning that you could potentially think about doing this for many years. Really importantly, though, these kinds of simulations are making assumptions about how CWD is transmitted. They make some big assumptions about the importance of that environmental transmission factor. They might assume that it's negligible. And they make some assumptions about the ways that hunting is implemented in populations and the way that deer react to high hunting. And we just don't know if all of those assumptions are true in wild populations. So we really want some evidence from real populations that have variation in hunting. And that evidence has been a lot harder to come by. There are very few studies that have gone out and measured hunting levels and the associated changes in CWD. And that's for a few reasons. One is, again, there's not a lot of states that have a really long history with CWD. And they may not implement this in an experimental way that lets you study the direct effects of harvest. There's been a couple studies that have compiled data from different locations, and they've tried to look at the correlation between CWD and hunting levels. One of those studies is this, produced this plot that I'm showing here. This looked at hunting rates and CWD across mule deer herds in the Western US and Canada. And they found that when they put all these data into the model, their model predicted that that increase in CWD was slower. You can see these curves in green where there's high hunting. It was slower when there was high hunting compared to when there was not high levels of hunting. And they also found that shifting the timing of harvest closer to the breeding season also seemed to help. So this is some limited evidence that also provides us some proof that hunting might be a useful management tool. So harvest could be a useful tool. We have some evidence, a lot of it's from theory, and it's a very popular tool. It's already being implemented, but the reality is that it's not a silver bullet. It does come with some pretty important challenges and trade-offs. One is that implementing a high rate of hunting over a long time period can change herd structure, can change herd size. And that's important because it changes recreational opportunities. And what I mean by that is if you harvest a lot of mature bucks for a long time, you reduce the opportunity for people to harvest a trophy animal, which is a big motivating factor for a lot of people that participate in hunting. And we also know that depending on how you implement harvest, and if females are also harvested, you may also have some impacts on population abundances as well. Compared to some other management tools, using hunting to control CWD requires the support of the public and from the hunting community in particular. And so often that can be hard to find. There can be some resistance to changing population structure, and there can also be some resistance to wanting to harvest a deer in an area that has CWD because of risks about consuming an infected deer. So it really requires public support, and some agencies that have tried to increase hunting have actually really struggled with this aspect and have found those policies to be really unpopular. And of course, you can't implement those policies if they're unpopular because it requires people to buy licenses. So that's a major challenge here, is actually the implementation and getting people on board with this strategy. And lastly, in other disease systems, in other species, when they've used these removal-based strategies, sometimes they come with some unexpected consequences ecologically. So a famous example comes from the culling of badgers in the United Kingdom. That was done to try and slow the spread of tuberculosis to cattle. So they went out and removed a bunch of badgers throughout the UK, and they actually were surprised to find that the remaining badgers did all sorts of surprising things. They changed their behaviors. They went to new locations. they interacted with different individuals than they would normally interact with because this culling disrupted their social structure. And so they actually saw tuberculosis spreading to completely new areas after they implemented this. Now, we don't have a sense that that's going to happen in deer, but that's just a sign that there are sometimes ecological surprises that happen when you take on a big challenge and you really shift the management of a population. So implementing these high rates of hunting is not without risks. And so agencies really want to feel confident that this strategy is going to work before they decide to take that risk and expend the amount of energy that it takes to really increase hunting over a long time period. So just to sum up, there are a few strategies available for controlling CWD, not as many as we might like, but hunting is one of the big strategies that's currently used. Many agencies are increasing harvest to try and slow CWD. That has some risks and trade-offs, and so we really need some real-world evidence that tells us if it's working or not. So I mentioned one study that has looked at harvest and CWD in mule deer populations across the US and Canada. And there's been a couple of other studies that have also attempted to do this. And in general, what these studies do is they correlate harvest pressure. So they might quantify the number of licenses sold or the number of individuals harvested. And they correlate that with CWD prevalence. And what these studies tend to find is that CWD is lower in locations where harvest is high, and CWD is higher in locations where harvest is low. And the question is this proof that hunting reduces CWD? And that's a really important question. We all know that correlation is not causation, and we really want to know if hunting causes a change in CWD, because that is what we need to feel confident in if we want to implement this as a management strategy. So we're really interested in this purple arrow, harvest having a direct effect on CWD. But we know that a correlation between harvest and CWD can also arise because CWD can have effects on harvest. For example, harvest might be low where CWD is high because hunters don't want to hunt in a high CWD area, or because there's fewer individuals to be available for harvest. So there's a possibility that this relationship is actually caused by the reverse relationship. And then there could also be a correlation between CWD and harvest because there's variables that affect both of these things simultaneously. So these are pretty important questions. Again, we really want to know if this purple arrow exists. But when we just go out and make these kinds of correlational studies, we can't really feel confident that that's exactly what we're measuring. That's really what we wanted to think more about in the study that I'm going to tell you about today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about one study that we just wrapped up where we tried to quantify this relationship between hunting rates and CWD. And we used some tools to try and nail down this issue of correlation not being causation. And I'm not going to dive into all the statistics today, but I'll just mention that that was a big motivation for this study. So we did this study in Wyoming, which is a unique state in that it has had a long history with CWD. It's been present in many of the herds, mule deer herds in the state since the early 2000s. So we worked with a data set of disease surveillance data provided by the state of Wyoming. They had really good data on 10 different mule deer herds, all of which had CWD since the early 2000s. They had pretty large variation in how much hunting those herds experienced, and they had pretty big variation in how quickly CWD spread through those populations. And so what we analyzed in this study was the proportion of adult males that were infected. That's just because there's not a lot of data on what's happening in adult females. And then we analyzed how that was related to the harvest pressure in each of these herds. You can see some of these herds just really, they've had CWD for a long time, but it just hasn't gone anywhere. And in some of these herds, it pretty quickly went to over 50%. So we're pretty interested in what's causing that variation. And so I'll pretty briefly run through our main findings. The first thing we found was that herds that had really high harvest pressure over the entire 20 years of the study. So there was one herd where 40% of males were harvested every single year on average for 20 years. And in that herd, prevalence remained really low. And at the lower end of the spectrum, where you're not removing that many males, where the harvest pressure is pretty low, there is often prevalence exceeding 50%. So again, we're seeing this correlation between harvest pressure and CWD prevalence. That's pretty striking. But we also want to know, we want to make sure that this is actually caused by the effects of CWD on, or the effects of harvest on CWD. And it's not just that these herds with high harvest pressure have some other factor that makes them less susceptible to CWD. So we also looked within each herd and we asked what happens when hunting increases or decreases relative to average within that single herd. And what that analysis told us is that there was still an effect of harvest, but it was much smaller. So here, this green line is showing what the trajectory of CWD might look like in a herd where about a third of males are harvested every single year on average. And then say you bump that up to 40% or you decrease it to 20% over a 3-year period, you can see it makes a dent, but not a huge one. And on the right, you can see us directly comparing the effects of increasing harvest for 1 year, increasing it for 3 years, and increasing it for 20 years. And you can see that the longer you do it, the bigger the dent that you make. I think that intuitively makes sense, but at the same time, a lot of agencies have started off trying to change harvest and they don't see an effect and people are upset and they abandon that strategy, or they're not able to sustain the enthusiasm for it. And this research tells us that there is some benefit to being patient and to expect that these effects might take a long time or need to be implemented for a long time to be successful. So here I'm just showing the direct comparison of how these differences in hunting rates can play out over longer time periods. These are modeled predictions based on the data from the state of Wyoming. And you can see, again, a really high harvest level that's sustained for 20 years tends to keep CWD pretty low, although it does not eradicate it. And that CWD can quickly spread in populations where hunting pressure is low. And you can also see that these shaded areas, which represent our uncertainty in those predictions, are pretty big. So we're not able to pin down an exact prediction for what prevalence should be. There's a lot of variation across different herds and a lot of unpredictability still about the trajectory that CWD might take. So I showed you that herds with higher harvest have lower CWD. We wanted to just make sure that there's no opposite relationship. Is it just that herds that have lots of CWD have lower harvest? We looked into this and we analyzed whether higher chronic wasting disease prevalence was associated with lower harvest rates in subsequent years. We used a few different ways of measuring harvest, but we didn't find any relationships. And you don't need to worry about all the numbers here. Essentially, herds that had higher CWD didn't see a decrease in the proportion of males harvested, the number of males harvested, and the licenses sold. So at least in the state of Wyoming, where there is a lot of demand for hunting licenses, there doesn't seem to be evidence of this gray arrow. This is a little bit more evidence that what we're finding is this direct effect of harvest on CWD. The last thing we did is we ran 12 different models, which I will not go into in detail, but all of these different statistical models controlled for different types of confounding variables. These are things that might affect both hunting and CWD at the same time and could make it difficult for us to estimate the relationship between those two variables. And we looked at the effect of hunting in all of those models and to see whether it was consistent. And it turns out that most of those models showed us that there's not much of an effect for changing hunting for just 1 year. So here we're looking at these 12 different models on the y-axis. And if a point is to the left of that dotted line, and if it's red, it means that harvest in that model is showing a significantly negative effect on CWD. So it's reducing CWD. If it's gray, it means it has no effect. And if it were blue, it would mean it's actually increasing CWD. So really, most of the models told us if you increase hunting for 1 year, you're not likely to make a dent in CWD. But if you do it for at least 3 years or longer, those models are all telling us that there's a significantly negative effect on CWD. So it's doing something to reduce CWD, but they really disagree on how big that effect is. And that means that we feel fairly confident that hunting is having a negative effect on prevalence. It's reducing prevalence, but we are having a hard time pinning down the exact effect. So we can't say if you hunt 35% of males, your prevalence will be 20%. We're not able to make that precise of a prediction yet. And we may never be able to make that precise of a prediction because there's a lot of random variables that play out in the spread of an infectious disease. So just to return to this question, we did find a correlation between harvest and CWD, a negative correlation, and we did not find any evidence that it was caused by any of these other arrows. So we are feeling more confident that there is really a causal relationship of harvest on CWD, which means that if you do implement higher levels of harvest, that it's fairly likely that you will see a slower rate of spread of CWD in that population. So just some take homes. Maintaining harvest pressure on adult males does seem to slow CWD, especially when it's applied for a long time frame. So patience is a virtue with this management tool. It's not something like COVID-19 where you can quickly implement a management strategy and see effects over the course of a year. This is something that should be expected to take decades or might need to be applied early in an epidemic and continued for a long time period. And even in herds where there was high harvest pressure over a really long time period, CWD was not eradicated. So setting realistic expectations is important. CWD may always be there. It's really hard to eradicate it without also eradicating your deer population. We have not seen it be eradicated through recreational harvest alone, but it can definitely be slowed and in some cases mildly decreased over time. And again, we still can't predict the precise impacts of a given level of hunting. So we still need to do some more studies to try to pin down what leads to some variation in those predictions. And I'll end with just some questions that I still have about this that we're hoping to address through new research and things that we still need to know if we're going to try to implement this strategy most efficiently and most effectively. So I mentioned there's a lot of different mechanisms through which hunting can affect CWD. Our study doesn't tell us exactly which mechanisms are at play. And that's pretty important because it helps us optimize the strategy. For instance, we don't know how hunting high rates of males affects prevalence in female deer. And we also don't know that much about the effects of hunting a lot of female deer on harvest. So we need to know a little bit more about that. It might tell us whether we need to harvest females, whether we need to harvest both classes. And I think that can be supported by more data on other age sex classes besides males. We currently pretty much only conduct surveillance on adult males. So we could learn a little bit about surveilling some of these other populations, and we could learn a lot from doing some more modeling studies that get at some of these different mechanisms. A question that a lot of management agencies have is, do we still have to harvest high rates after we have population declines due to other factors? For example, if there's a harsh winter that kills off a lot of deer, do you have to have a really high hunt rate the following season? A lot of agencies are not comfortable doing that. They want to back off harvest after a particularly harsh winter or an outbreak of another disease. Answering that question is really important. It's possible that these other die-offs have the same effect as hunting does, and that they might reduce disease. And if so, we can sort of back off and let populations recover a little bit or not hunt them quite as hard after they undergo these declines. But we still have not been able to answer this question. We need some more data that incorporates some of these other sources of mortality. A big question is, can we actually do this? Will people go out and continue to hunt adult males for many, many years? And what are the trade-offs, both in terms of recreational opportunities and trade-offs in terms of the ecology of these deer populations, having fewer individuals on the landscape or younger individuals on the landscape. So some of this will require more biological science, and some of it will require more social science on what people want to see out of their deer herds and what they're managing for, what their objectives are. And then lastly, this was a study in one state in the US and on mule deer in particular. We don't really know much about what's true of hunting and CWD in whitetail deer or in elk. We don't know much about it on the on the east coast of the US and Canada. And so we really need to be collecting data from other systems, other species, and other regions to know how generalizable this is. And we haven't yet done that work. So the last thing I'll say is we have evidence that hunting is having a negative effect on CWD. There's evidence to say that backing off or lifting your foot from the gas pedal early in an epidemic might not help control CWD. It might be detrimental, but we also know that hunting is not going to eradicate CWD, and it's really part of a portfolio of strategies that can help control the disease. So it's not a silver bullet. It's not the only thing an agency can or should do, but it can be deployed alongside some of these other strategies. And lastly, hunting also helped provide surveillance information. So that's where the majority of agencies get information on how many individuals are infected and where it is. And so continuing to hunt not only is a management strategy in and of itself, but it also helps assess the effectiveness of that management strategy. So it's important for both of those reasons. So thank you all for listening. I want to acknowledge my collaborators and my co-authors on this work. This was done by the USGS, the Northern Rocky Mountain Science Center, alongside a team of folks from the Wyoming Game and Fish Department. And if you want to know more about this study, you can read our paper and some of the press release and articles that USGS has published on this work. And with that, I will take any questions.
Awesome. Thanks, Dr. Moss. And I don't have anything in the hopper yet. I'm sure there'll be a few that come in as we go. With some of those other mechanisms, how up to speed are you on the literature? I talked about what other agencies are using in terms of managing baiting, that sort of thing. Is that something that you're up to speed on in terms of efficacy or what we think it will do?
Yeah, so we know that baiting and other anthropogenic food sources that provide supplemental food to animals, we know that those provide transmission opportunities. So even without going out and collecting data, we can say that is a place where we know individuals can be transmitting the disease. There's been some work in the U.S. on the national wildlife refuges that are doing a lot of supplemental feeding. So it's not baiting for hunting, but it is feeding elk in particular during the winter season. Mm-hmm. And there's been a lot of modeling work showing what impact that increased contact rate could have. And so it's certainly a big factor that could be a risk factor and sort of an easy target for reducing transmission. And a lot of states are banning baiting. One thing that is worth considering is that with these supplemental resources, if you start removing them and you don't remove all of them, you can have one left, and then it's even more of an attractant. And so you want to think carefully about kind of the spatial scale and how that's implemented to not create an even bigger hotspot where all these individuals are congregating. So a lot to think about in terms of how to deploy that management policy.
Thank you. We have one from Facebook, but it's is there any preventive measures that BC is trying to implement aside from culling? And I don't think Dr. Moss is going to be up to speed on all of the things we're doing in BC. Kate is our person for that, and she, I think, was on this webinar, but we'll have to revert to some of our other data and our other columns on that one. Here we go. We've got a few. Given the vectors of infection and the resilience of prions, it appears that inevitable CWD will make its way into all of the population at some point. Are we not just prolonging the inevitable?
I certainly think it's hard to not look at that map and see it marching across North America and not feel that way. At the same time, I think the pace of research has been really fast on CWD. So if it turns out that we are just prolonging it, I actually think that does buy a lot of time for developing some of these other strategies. And I also think part of this is maybe thinking about managing a population that looks different, that can sustain a high rate of CWD. So if you have a young population where a lot of reproduction is happening, then actually that population might persist through CWD. It's definitely a shift in what you expect out of your deer populations, but I think it's true that given the current tools we have not been successful at eradicating it. So we are kind of in this realm of trying to slow it down and get it to a level where we can still have recreational opportunities, where we can still have deer on the landscape. And we might have to adjust sort of our vision of what success is until we have some more effective, easily deployed strategies like vaccines or other tools.
Awesome. Thank you. This question always comes up. This person joined a little late. And I'm sure you can cover this. Can the disease be transmitted to humans? That comes up every time we have one of the webinars.
Yeah. And it's a question I would be asking too, because there's a lot of parallels between CWD and diseases like mad cow disease.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's been a lot of work asking that question. I don't personally work on that question, but I'm aware of a lot of work that's happening both experimentally and just statistically, looking at hunters that have harvested or consumed an infected deer. So far, we have no cases of humans contracting it. The fact that mad cow disease, which is a prion disease, infected humans at one point in time, has given people some pause, and they're thinking about this risk. And I'll just say, again, that has not happened to our knowledge. It hasn't happened in experiments. And it would be scary if it had, for sure. But what would need to happen for it to be a really scary epidemic in humans is for it not only to infect us, but to become infectious in us and contagious in us. And that didn't happen with mad cow, which means people could get sick from eating an infected from eating infected meat, but they couldn't give it to their neighbor, which, it's still pretty scary, but it means that the management of this risk is a personal decision. You could decide not to consume an infected deer and manage that risk. You're not going to contract CWD from your neighbor. So maybe that provides a little bit of reassurance. And again, we don't have any evidence that it's happened. And many people are looking for that evidence and have not been able to find it.
Okay, got it. So it's possible that you could die, but you probably won't kill your neighbors. Got it. Okay. With area states where CWD has been high, like Montana, there's also a lot of migratory deer. Has this been used as a cross reference? So I guess really the question is, and this is the BC case, certainly where we have CWD, long migrations, especially with elk, but we're going to have mule deer that cross into Montana. Go down into Idaho and all the way out towards Alberta, like some pretty big movements. Did you look at that in terms of how the disease is spread or how fast it moves?
I haven't looked at that in my own work. I am aware of studies that are going on comparing how CWD spreads through migratory populations versus non-migratory populations. So it's a really good question and people are working on it. I will say in white-tailed deer, you see high CWD, and those are for the most part non-migratory. So we know it can happen in non-migratory populations and in migratory populations. So it certainly can happen in both types. But I think the question about whether it is going to lead to faster geographic spread is a really good one. And a lot of people are working on that. And unfortunately, I don't know the answer to it today.
Right, because there's maybe a sub question that's certainly been discussed only because we have it in a very small geographic area, is the thought of putting up barriers or movement barriers or even fences. Like we're talking a relatively small patch of ground. I would say in your language, like 4 miles by 4 miles, something like that. But has there been any work done on that in terms of trying to isolate cervid populations to contain it, to keep it from moving?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. In places where there's been efforts to change the movement of deer, and one that I'm thinking of, this wasn't the purpose of supplemental feeding, but again, in this population I've mentioned where they supplementally feed individuals during the winter and they don't migrate, it has the downside of concentrating those animals and leading to more transmission. And so it sounds like a good idea. They're not going to move to it, spread it to a new area. But the downside, again, is this change in behavior that can really shift contact rates among individuals. So I don't know if it would come out on top. I think it depends when in the epidemic you start to contain movement. I think it's a lot easier to contain human mediated movement, like movement of carcasses, than it is to contain deer movement without some unexpected consequences.
Sure. Awesome. Okay, how long has CWD been present in the population? So do you recall for Wyoming how long they've been testing and when they first got some positives?
I know in these herds that many of the first positives were in the early 2000s. I don't remember the year that CWD arrived in wild deer in Wyoming, but I think it was maybe the late 90s. So it's been in Wyoming. I would say Wyoming and Colorado are two of the states where it's been the longest in the US. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question. But there's plenty of opportunity for CWD to have spread in these populations, having been there for more than 2 decades.
Awesome. Awesome. Any other questions? I see we got a few folks from other universities on as well. I'll leave it open here for a couple of minutes. And I see if Kate or Dr. Merrill, if you have any questions, feel free. But thank you, Dr. Moss, I guess. Awesome presentation, really quick and snappy. I like it. It keeps people's attention. We will be sure to put this up on our YouTube channel as well. We've got a bunch of members who weren't able to attend tonight, but we'll be looking for it and we'll share it with all the folks. I'm sure Kate will show it with the folks in the BC government as well. And,
Great.
you know.
Thanks. And I'll throw my email up here again in case folks have any questions. I'm happy to chat more about CWD and what we found in this study.
Awesome. Okay, and then maybe one more before we go. Why is it that the lymph nodes or Orbex have to be tested versus a blood sample?
Yeah, just given the way that these proteins accumulate in the body, it's more likely to be detected in those tissues. It prefers the central nervous system and it doesn't circulate that much in blood. There is prion usually in blood, in muscle, in feces, and saliva, and a lot of people are working on diagnostic tests that use those, but they're just not as sensitive as some of those other tissues at this point in time.
Awesome. Well, thank you, and thanks everyone for attending tonight. Great job, great presentation, very well done. Our next webinar is June 10th with Sam Foster, who's actually defending his for his PhD this Friday, and we'll send a link out to our members. He's our camera person who is doing his PhD on the Sedentary Mule Deer Project, which is one of kind of our flagship projects. So his presentation is Human Disturbance, Reshape Large Mammal Behavior, Habitat Use, and Community Composition. We'll be sending something out to our members because he's defending on Friday, but he'll also be on June 10th here for our next webinar. So thank you all for attending. Dr. Moss, great work. Hopefully we can connect on your next paper. I'm sure there's other stuff that's in the works around CWD, and share and learn and keep on trying to get a handle on CWD here across our province and across, I guess, the continent.
Thank you.
Thanks. See you all.